The Fellowship of the Ring were a diverse group. 4 hobbits, 2 men, a dwarf, an elf, and a Maya posing as a wizard. They had different backgrounds, were from vastly different places, and ranged from barely a few decades old to thousands of years old. Despite this, they also communicated with each other fairly well. So in this video, let's talk about each of the languages that each member of the Fellowship knew. Okay, so let's start with the one language that every member of the Fellowship knew, Westron. Westron was a language that developed late in the Second Age, a mix of Adunaic and various pre-Numenorian languages, and a little bit of Sindarin. Thanks to already being fairly widespread along the coastlines of the Westlands, it became the main official language of Arnor and Gondor. Wherever those two kingdoms went, Westron went with them, and because they were powerful and influential, Westron spread to many neighbouring lands where it became used as a second language. By the end of the Third Age, it was spoken by most people, from Forakel in the north to Umbar in the south, and from Lindon in the west to the Sea of Rune in the east. Even many orc tribes spoke it as a native language. So this was the main language of communication for the Fellowship, even though the sub-dialects were slightly different. For example, the Hobbits had their own dialect, Gondorians had a more formal version. For Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin it was their native language, and in the case of the latter 3 it was the only language they knew. So every time they are speaking in the books you should assume that the conversation is in Westron. The language also would have been a native language to Aragorn and Boromir. As for Gimli and Legolas, as high nobility within their own kingdoms, they would have been expected to know it, and in the case of Gimli, he probably used it a lot in his life. As for Gandalf, well, I mean, it's Gandalf. He's a wizard, he's meant to know these things. I just mentioned that Sam, Merry and Pippin could only speak Westron, so they won't feature again in this video. But our last hobbit, Frodo, had some knowledge of Sindarin and even Quenya. He learned this from Bilbo, who became so proficient in Sindarin and Quenya that he was able to translate texts. Frodo, however, never became as good as Bilbo. His knowledge of Quenya seemed to be limited to just a few phrases. As for Sindarin, Frodo could speak a little, but he was far from fluent. He could understand the elves in Gildor's company, and the rangers of Ithilien when they were speaking Sindarin. However, he can't understand the accented Sindarin spoken in Lothlorien by some of the Sylvan elves, and mistakenly believes it to be another language entirely. Let's move on to Boromir next. As far as we're aware, he only speaks Westron during the journey, but he almost certainly knew Sindarin as well. Although Boromir's fluency in Sindarin is never explicitly stated, it seems impossible that he couldn't speak it to a reasonable degree, given his upbringing. While Westron was the language of commoners in Gondor and Arnor, Sindarin was the language of the Dunedain, being brought over by Elendil and his sons following the downfall of Numenor. Even in the late Third Age, Gondor is the place where the most Sindarin speakers can be found, and it's used as a daily language by many people in places like Minas Tirith and Dol Amroth. As I mentioned earlier, we even encountered Ithilien rangers using Sindarin while Frodo is around. So knowing all of this, it would be insane if Boromir couldn't understand and speak Sindarin to a passable degree. He's the son of the steward, he would have received the best education possible, he lived in a city where it was spoken daily, and he was the commander of soldiers who also spoke it quite often. The fact we don't see Boromir use Sindarin in the books can be explained as him not needing to use it, and perhaps not wanting to use it unless necessary. Next, let's talk Legolas. On top of Westron, Legolas would have spoken at least 2 languages. One being Sindarin, and the other being the language of the Sylvan Elves, Nandoran, or Sylvan, we'll call it Sylvan for the video. Now, despite Legolas being the Prince of Mirkwood, a Sylvan realm, he himself was a Sindar. In the early Second Age, his grandfather, Orifer, a Sindar noble of Doriath, led a group of Sindar to Mirkwood, Greenwood at the time, where he was made king of the local Sylvan Elves. Unlike Lothlorien, where the Sylvan language was eventually replaced by Sindarin, Mirkwood seems to have mixed reports. In some writings, Sindarin replaced Sylvan, but in others, the Sindar in Mirkwood adopted Sylvan instead. What we do know for a fact is that Legolas speaks Sindarin, because we see him using it with other elves in Lothlorien. As for Sylvan, while we don't see Legolas use it, it would make sense for him to know it. After all, many of his father's subjects were Sylvan elves, and while it's possible that many of these knew Sindarin too, it's no guarantee. For those purposes, as Prince of Mirkwood, it would make sense for Legolas to have also learned Sylvan. We just don't see him use it, because there's no real reason to use it outside of Mirkwood. Next, let's talk Gimli. What we can say for certain is that outside Westron, Gimli spoke at least one other language, and that was Khuzdul. Khuzdul was the language of the dwarves, all 7 clans devised by Aule himself. It was kept extremely secret, only spoken in private with other dwarves and rarely taught to outsiders, who usually struggled with it. We see Gimli throw around a few phrases in battle, but other than that, he's always using Westron because there's absolutely no reason to use Khuzdul. However, there's a high possibility that Gimli spoke another language, the Northman tongue of the Men of Dale, often called Dalish by fans. The reason for this is that dwarves always adopted the languages of the people around them, even using it for their names, and in the case of the dwarves of Erebor, it was the Men of Dale. While the Men of Dale did speak Westron, Dalish was their native language, so it's likely that most of the dwarves of Erebor used this language while dealing with them. After all, the relations between these two peoples were centuries old. Next is Aragorn. As you would expect, Aragorn also spoke Sindarin, almost certainly fluently. After all, he was one of the Dunedain and was raised in Rivendell, a place where everyone would have spoken that language. Frodo witnesses him using it with an unnamed elf in Lothlorien. On top of Sindarin, Aragorn also seems to have spoken at least some Quenya. Quenya was like the Latin of Middle-earth, a prestigious tongue that was only really used as a language of law since the First Age. As a royal who grew up in Rivendell, Aragorn likely would have learned it as well, and while we're not sure if he was fluent, he does recite Elendil's oath at his coronation in Quenya. But we're not done. While in Rohan, Aragorn demonstrates that he has a decent understanding of the language of Rohan. You've probably seen it called Rohirric, but Tolkien actually called it Rohanese. Yes, Rohanese. He recites a poem in Rohanese and is later able to translate another Rohanese song fairly well. He likely learned this language while serving in the court of Thengel, Theoden's father. Not that it would have been necessary, for Thengel had actually served in Gondor earlier in his life and was fluent in Westron and possibly knew Sindarin as well. It's also possible that Aragorn knew some other languages too. As the heir to the Númenórean legacy, he might have known Adunaic, the direct ancestor of Westron, but possibly not because the language was effectively dead in the Westlands and had negative connotations thanks to the corruption of the Númenóreans. Considering that he also travelled deep into Rhûn and Harad, he might have also picked up some of the languages of those lands, although I doubt he would have been anything close to fluent because he didn't spend enough time there. The last member of the Fellowship is Gandalf. Gandalf is an immortal being, who dwelt in Middle-earth for 2,000 years and did not have a permanent home. He was constantly on the move and dealing with many different peoples. This caused him to receive many different names: Tharkun to the dwarves, Greyheim to the Rohirrim, Mithrandir in Gondor, and Incarnus in the south, possibly Rad. So the better question is, what languages didn't Gandalf speak? Okay, so Gandalf's native language was Valarin. This language is described as so strange that it was unpleasant to the ears of the elves, so the Ainur communicated with them in Quenya. It's also likely that Gandalf learned Sindarin in Valinor, likely either through already knowing common Telerin from the Teleri at Alcalonde, or from the exiles who returned from Middle-earth in the Second Age. Gandalf also then learned Westron, either upon arriving in Middle-earth, or possibly from some elves in Valinor who had learned it before sailing into the west. While in Rivendell, he uses Sauron's Black Speech, suggesting that he has a knowledge of that language as well. Apart from those languages, we're not sure, but Gandalf does say before the doors of Moria that "I once knew every spell in all the tongues of elves or men or orcs." There's probably some hyperbole here, but given Gandalf's extensive travellings and interactions, he may have learned other languages too. Sylvan, Dalish, Rohanese, Entish, maybe even a language from Harad. In The Hobbit, he even claims to understand some of the Wargs. The only language that Gandalf indicates that he doesn't know is Khuzdul, but given the rest of his knowledge, he might not be telling the whole truth here. Alright, so because all of the Fellowship spoke Westron, communication wasn't a problem, but if the Fellowship needed to use a second language, then that language would have been Sindarin. Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas, and very likely Boromir would be fluent. Frodo has a decent understanding, things would just need to be translated for Gimli and the other hobbits. Apart from that, we don't have any other confirmed common languages, with the exception of Gandalf and Aragorn likely being able to speak to each other in Quenya. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you want more videos about languages, please let me know. I was thinking about doing a video showing where each languages were spoken on a map of the Westlands because, you know, the more maps, the better. Cheers, farewell, and remember, just like Aragorn, the character that he played, Viggo Mortensen is also fluent in a bunch of languages. Truly the perfect casting.